Thanks, Samantha. Enough handouts? Okay. For those of you who hate math, even at the high school level mathematics, relax, and there will be no equations, only propositions in my presentation. I'm not going to talk about Hamiltonian principles, unfortunately, nor do I talk about Galois theory, but hopefully we will be seeing something eventually closer to that regarding the nature of human language, inner workings, not variation, but inner workings of the core system of human language. What I'm going to be presenting is an interim report of ongoing research, actually collaborating research that I have been working with members of my research group. There are 4 of them, Kato, Taka Kato, and Masa Kuno, and Mihoko Zushi, and on this topic, particularly Hiroki Narita, as is indicated on the handout. I usually don't do this, but we prepared the script so that, because I was not 100% sure that I could be here, so no matter who ends up reading it, the same message could be conveyed to you. So we prepared that, so now I have to read it, sort of unwillingly, but let me get started. Well, as the title suggests, the goal of this talk is to investigate the nature of the computational procedure of the human language, in particular its fundamental operation merge, and the structural symmetry and asymmetry it generates. Under the most general formulation, merge is a generative procedure that combines n, typically 2, syntactic objects, SOs, and forms an unordered pair, that is, a set of them, without specifying any other information such as labels or projection that has been stipulated in classical expert theory, for example. The simple and widely assumed bare phrase structure model thus holds that the mechanism of structure generation consists of the following 2 components. One is narrow syntax that executes merge, and the other is a lexicon, which stores a finite set of lexical items, LIs, that constitute atoms for merge. Well, as pointed out by Chomsky, it can be either that alpha and beta are separate SOs, or that one is part of the other, and this yields a bifurcation of external merge and internal merge, as defined in 2. Okay, skip. I'm not going to read it. 3 represents an example of external merge, which combines 2 independent SOs, eat and the apple. In contrast, internal merge combines 1 SO and one of its terms, say for A, we will see what, and its term what, and it creates another occurrence of what at the age of 4A, yielding the so-called copy theory of movement. Well, importantly, these 2 modes of merge seem to be systematically tied with quite different syntactic and semantic consequences. For example, it has been observed by Chomsky and others that the bifurcation of external and internal merge closely correlates with the so-called duality of semantics. An old observation sort of going back to the 1960s, which states that there are, broadly speaking, 2 classes of semantic properties, the so-called deep structure, D structure, and surface structure, S structure interpretations. D structure interpretation typically involves theta-related properties, such as selection and predicate argument structure, and S structure interpretation involves various discourse-related properties, such as new-old information, topic focus, operator scope, specificity, and so on. Chomsky's important observation is that this duality of semantics finds a close correspondence to the bifurcation of external and internal merge. Thus, external merge typically feeds D structure interpretation, and internal merge S structure interpretation. 6, yes. In this talk, we would like to add several more generalizations regarding the nature of merge-based syntax. The second approximation is concerned with the endocentricity of D structure semantics. Recall that D structure interpretation typically involves selection and theta marking. Under the traditional assumption, these D structure relations are typically established in the so-called head complement relation. For example, a transitive verb takes an NP as its complement and assigns an object theta role to it. More generally, properties of destructure semantics are in most cases primarily configured by a designated lexical head and its complement. In contrast, it is not clear whether S-structure semantics is endocentric in any meaningful sense. What would be the head of a topic focus or theme ream structure, for example? What about the operator scope construction or specificity? There's no simple answer to these questions, but it seems reasonable to say that there's little evidence to stipulate headedness or endocentricity for these S-structure interpretations. That's 9. Okay, a related observation is that structures feeding destructure interpretation is often encoded in asymmetric branching. If you recall configurations feeding selectional or theta-related interpretation as shown in 10A to E, we can find that phrasal SOYP, they almost always involve, I skipped one line, they almost always involve asymmetric SOs consisting of a lexical item X0 and the phrasal SOYP, though with an important exception of the merger of an external argument, a case which we will discuss shortly below. Well, these are traditionally called head complement configurations. So 6 and 9 point to the close connection between destructure semantics, the structural asymmetry of head complement configurations, and the semantic endocentricity. Well, finally, we would like to point out that the opposite pattern is true for internal merge. As we said, S-structure semantics that internal merge feeds is non-endocentric. And further, internal merge typically moves a phrase to the edge of another phrase, yielding symmetric structures of the form set XPYP. For example, WH movement dislocates a WH phrase to the spec C position, and A movement or subject raising moves an NP to the spec T position. Yes, there. Thus, it is a curious fact about the internal merge that unlike external merge, it almost always generates symmetric XPYP structure. Okay, so external merge seems to always create X0YP structure, whereas internal merge seems to create XPYP symmetric structures. That's the kind of pattern we are seeing. So generalization 13, that's a kind of preliminary version, is stated there. Now, these 4 observations point to an interesting generalization concerning merge and its effect on the syntax semantics interface. As shown in 13, we reviewed 4 conceptual dimensions: external versus internal merge, asymmetric versus symmetric branching, destructure versus S-structure semantics, and endocentric versus non-endocentric interpretations. And it seems that these 4 dichotomies closely correlate with one another. Thus, external merge typically results in asymmetric X0YP branching, as I said, endocentric destructure semantics, whereas internal merge results in symmetric XPYP branching and non-endocentric S-structure semantics. Well, the purpose of this talk is to argue that this correlation is indeed not accidental. We will refine and sharpen the rough generalization stated in 13 and attempt to provide a possible explanation for this systematic dichotomy. 2, well, obviously, sharpening the generalization. Well, obviously, the observation in 13 is quite rough as it stands now, and it faces a couple of difficulties in explaining the whole variety of linguistic structures. One of the most obvious problems is that it fails to explain cases where external merge yields symmetric structures. 2 obvious cases come to my mind that fall under this category are head movement and the merger of an external argument. We will discuss them one by one and sharpen 13 in such a way that it can accommodate its apparent counterexamples. 2.1, exceptional case 1, number 1, head movement case. Well, the first case we would like to discuss is head movement, X0 movement. Although it is currently contested rather hotly as to whether head movement is in fact syntactic or not, The traditional assumption is that it is really a form of syntactic movement that adjoins an li x0 to another li y0 that C commands it. Let's assume so for the moment. If such a movement really exists, which is questionable, of course, as an instance of merge, and if we keep to the definition of merge as a simple set formation operation, then such an application of merge just generates another set x0, y0 without tampering with the SO in 14a. Then it yields two partially overlapping SOs of the form in 14b. Notice that this operation yields an apparently symmetric branching, x0, y0. Moreover, the occurrence of y0 is obviously not a term of x0. Thus, this instance of merge should count as external merge under Chomsky's definition 2, reproduced below. Yeah, there. Okay. However, external merge in head movement is quite different in a number of respects from the canonical instances of external merge. Rather, its similarity to internal merge is obvious. First of all, head movement is obviously a movement operation, just like internal merge, and it yields copies of x0. Further, head movement also patterns with internal merge in terms of a preliminary generalization in 13. Namely, just like core cases of internal merge, head movement results in symmetric branching, in this case of the form x0, y0. In addition, if head movement has any semantic effect, it is always discourse related. For example, neg0 raising alters the scope of negation, T0 to C0 raising results in interrogative force, and so on and so forth. Therefore, if there is some truth to the generalization in 13, and if head movement really exists as a syntactic phenomenon, which may be questioned, of course, as I said, it seems natural to pursue a theory of merge that assimilates head movement to the category of internal merge. To do so, we may either replace the Chomskyan definition of internal versus external merge by 16. Merge alpha beta counts as internal merge if alpha and beta are terms of a single SO. Otherwise, blah, blah, blah. Or we may also abandon the external versus internal merge dichotomy and replace it with a new, not so unnatural bifurcation of base merge and non-base merge, as defined in 17. Base merge sort of corresponding to base step of a recursive definition, and non-base is a recursion step, as you know. Well, anyway, 17, merge alpha beta counts as base merge if either alpha or beta or both is drawn from the lexicon. Otherwise, alpha beta counts as non-base merge. So base merge has a kind of special status in that it takes an li from the lexicon. It sort of, starts the whole computational process. We remain neutral for the purpose of this talk with regard to the choice between 16 and 17. But either way, it is rather easy and also reasonable to say that head movement falls within the category of internal merge or non-base merge for the sake of the proposed generalization. Well, 2.2, a more serious problem pops up with regard to another case of external merge. It has to do with the merger of an external argument, as in 18, which has actually been a problem in Chomsky's analysis as well. Well, clearly, this is a case of external merge, and also this structure fits D-structure interpretation that is apparently endocentric, where the standard description says that little v is the alleged head of 18. However, it is also a case of symmetric branching consisting of two phrasal constituents. Thus, it is a clear deviation from the proposed generalization in 13. As is obvious from 19, in this case, we would rather like to assimilate this exceptional case to the category of asymmetric external merge, with which endocentricity and D-structure semantics are closely associated. Okay, 19, right up there. To keep the generalization in 13 intact vis-a-vis the merger of an external argument 18, we would like to propose an alternative characterization of structural symmetry in terms of features rather than LIs. Consider the structure in 18 again. Although this structure is symmetric in that it is a structure with two phrasal constituents, if we also take features of the relevant phrases into consideration, there is a certain sense in which the structure is actually asymmetric. Specifically, if we consider the head of an external argument, little np, and the verb phrase it is merging with, the asymmetry holding between their features is obvious. In particular, the little np is associated with 5 features, whereas no such feature is present in the little v. Well, there are, of course, theories in which the little v in the transitive verb construction is associated with a set of uninterpretable 5 features, but even in these theories, the 5 features are inherited to large capital V at the end of a derivation. I'm not going to go into the details in these alternatives. Well, thus the structure can be regarded as asymmetric in that only one of the 2 constituents is headed by 5 features. Exploring this kind of featural asymmetry, that is, asymmetry with respect to the distribution of features in SOs, we would like to propose the following concept of feature equilibrium in 20, and define the notion of structural symmetry in terms of this new concept. Notice, incidentally, that this proposal is based upon one of the traditional insights of expert theory, that features are ultimate atoms. It also goes along quite well with Chomsky's recent attempt at reformulating his labeling algorithm in terms of features. So 20, feature equilibrium, an SO alpha beta is in an F equilibrium with respect to a syntactic feature F, which means alpha and beta share F as their most prominent feature. The crucial concept of the most prominent feature, of course, remains to be made precise, as we noted in a footnote. That we have to do. But we need more empirical considerations to decide as to how actually we sharpen it and define it. Anyway, let's leave it kind of intuitive at this time. We advocate a characterization of a symmetry in 21, featural symmetry. And SO sigma is symmetric if, notice, this time it's not only if, but if. We will come back to this point later. If sigma is an F equilibrium with respect to some feature F, otherwise sigma is asymmetric. The definition in 21 can accommodate all the cases discussed so far. First, 21 points to the conclusion that XP, YP counts as symmetric only if it is in an F equilibrium. According to this definition, familiar XP, YP structures created by internal merge are classified as symmetric in this very sense. For example, the spec T structure, as shown in 22, is symmetric in that it forms a phi equilibrium. The subject little np raised to the spec of T typically undergoes phi feature agreement. Thus, little n and T share the phi features as their most prominent features. The case of WH movement, too, can be seen as symmetric because WH head and C undergo Q feature agreement by assumption. In contrast, 18 is seen as an asymmetric branching in that it does not form a feature equilibrium, given that no feature is shared by little n and little v. Therefore, capital XPYP structures created by familiar types of movement are correctly classified as symmetric, whereas the case of the external argument becomes asymmetric under the definition in 21. Moreover, X0YP structures, as in 10, reproduced here, are still correctly classified as asymmetric, since no feature of X0 can form a feature equilibrium with the head of YP in such configurations. Well, this way we propose a revised version of the generalization in 24, where the notion of symmetry, asymmetry is redefined now in terms of feature equilibrium. 24. Okay, 2.3. Now, while unconstrained merge can freely, we are putting random remarks on the nature of merge here and there, okay, without noting that we are claiming that. Because, well, as you know, there have been lots of current issues regarding the nature of merge, whether it is driven to apply or can it freely apply to any structure and so on and so forth. We are making some remarks kind of scattered throughout the handout. Okay, so unconstrained merge can freely combine SOs, generating both asymmetric and symmetric structures. But it seems that internal merge, non-base merge, typically results in symmetric structures. Subject raising results in a theta equilibrium, while WH movement results in a Q equilibrium. This pattern seems to be quite systematic, and we would like to know why this is almost always the case. To capture this state of affairs, we propose that the syntactic derivation is driven for the need of featural symmetry. The idea can be stated as 27. Each syntactic feature f must form an f equilibrium in the course of the derivation. Okay, that's the main thesis that we are sort of advancing for this talk. Lexical items are associated with their own feature contents, and external merge or base merge freely introduces LIs and their features in syntactic derivation. But 27, this principle, essentially states that once a syntactic feature, f, is introduced into the derivation, the subsequent derivation should guarantee that f be moved to a position where it can form an f equilibrium. Okay, so basically, asymmetric structure drives syntactic computation. That's the idea. This is achieved by internal merge or non-base merge. The subject raising is driven by the need for phi equilibrium, and WH movement is driven by the need for Q equilibrium. Further, we propose that head movement is also driven for symmetry. Recall that the prototypical case of head movement is root incorporation, such as capital V to little v and capital N to little n, which is supposed to be driven by the need for categorizing the root. We may describe this state of affairs by assuming that root categories are associated with an unvalued categorical feature that is in need of valuation by a neighboring categorizer. Then root incorporation can also be seen as driven by the need for categorical feature symmetry. This is shown in 28. Okay. Further, if we follow Chomsky 2007 and 8 in assuming that T's tensor feature is dependent upon C, then we may also say that T has an unvalued tensor feature that should be valued by an interpretable counterpart in C. And under this analysis, T to C incorporation can also be seen as driven for tensor feature, T feature symmetry. This way, 27 provides an important rationale for head movement. This movement, head movement operation, fulfills an important function of fixing the asymmetry of x0, yp and forming a feature equilibrium. More generally, 27, our main thesis, is articulating the view that asymmetric structures are unstable and must get stabilized by internal merge, non-base merge. Then linguistic computation is irreversibly directed towards symmetrization. And this idea provides a natural ordering of operations in 30. 30, external merge, base merge, arrow means entails, internal merge, non-base merge. For any syntactic feature f, an application of external merge, base merge, that creates an asymmetric structure entails a later application of internal merge, non-base merge, that yields an f equilibrium. This completes the rationalization of the proposed generalization in 31. Okay. Now let us move to section 3 and discuss some consequences of the theory we just proposed. Consequences of the theory of symmetry-driven syntax. Number 1, eliminating the notion of abstract case. Let us first point out that the idea of symmetry-driven syntax nullifies the need for the worrisome concept of abstract case. A number of properties have been attributed to this technical concept of abstract case. They are summarized as in 32. Abstract case under the traditional conception is distinguished from morphological case, is uninterpretable features par excellence, according to Chomsky, 95, is a device to capture the distribution of argument little np's, is a marker for argument foot as captured by the traditional visibility condition on chains, and is a trigger for A movement, that is last resort. Well, first of all, the distribution of little np's, noun phrases, can be accounted for by the notion of phi equilibrium. That is to say, canonical so-called case positions such as spec T or spec capital V are recast as positions that enter into a phi equilibrium as shown in 34 to 36. Yeah, and there are three cases. For example, the spec T position, that's 34, I think. Spec T, is that right? Yeah. Spec T position, that is a so-called nominative case position, is a place where little np can form a phi equilibrium at, yeah, with T. Yes, 34. Okay, moreover, if we follow the hypothesis that accusative case position is spec capital V, the same sort of analysis can be applied to accusative case checking as well, under the assumption that capital V is associated with unvalued phi features just like T, as shown in the proposed lexicon for English in 33. Yeah, that's a kind of tentative proposed lexicon for English. One possible way to further extend the analysis to the oblique case position as well is to adopt the known as PP shell analysis of prepositional phrases. That's one possibility. But anyway, whatever the details of the approach may turn out to be, then it seems reasonable to say that the account of the little NP distribution, the distribution of noun phrases, is no longer crucially dependent upon the notion of abstract case. Moreover, the effect of the traditional visibility condition as proposed in Chomsky 1986, based on Joseph Aoun's idea, largely follows as a straightforward consequence of a symmetry-driven syntax. Chomsky's version of the visibility condition is formulated as 37. An element is visible for theta marking only if it is assigned case. Recall that our theory defines theta positions as asymmetric positions and case positions as symmetric positions in terms of 5 features. Okay. Then what 37 states is essentially 38. Revised visibility condition 38. An NP that participates in asymmetric merge, that is external base merge, must also participate in symmetric merge, internal merge, noun-based merge. While 38 follows straightforwardly from the idea that linguistic computation is driven for symmetry. Thus, we don't really need any ad hoc stipulation to account for the effect of the visibility condition here. Furthermore, we propose that A movement is driven not for case feature checking, but for phi feature symmetry. Thus, the notion of abstract case as a trigger for A movement also becomes unnecessary in our analysis. It is simply that phi feature asymmetry, which serves for theta marking, cannot count as phi feature symmetry at the same time. Thus, A movement for case positions becomes an automatic consequence of a mechanism of symmetry-driven syntax, which is a desirable result. Okay. Okay, let's skip the rest of the section. But it should now be clear that the roles and functions traditionally attributed to abstract case, a rather dubious concept, can find independent explanations in the theory proposed here. Thus, no notion of abstract case needs to be invoked, and we can entirely eliminate recourse to the unwarranted, uninterpretable feature par excellence, which is again a highly desirable result. That's the first consequence of our proposal. Now, we argue that the idea of symmetry-driven syntax provides a rationale for the existence of often uninterpretable syntactic or formal features in human language. The notion of syntactic feature, or the notion of formal feature in Chomsky's terms, is understood as in 41. These features are distinguished from features that are interpretable at either of the two interfaces, and they must be checked off before the derivation reaches the interfaces. Okay. Why such an apparent imperfection exists in human language has been a big mystery in linguistic research, particularly in the minimalist program. However, we have proposed above that syntactic features are crucially at stake in providing the bifurcation of symmetric and asymmetric structures, which in turn closely correlates with the duality of semantics. Then we may posit a possible rationale for the presence of syntactic features, as in 42. Why are they present in human language? 42, just kind of speculation. We speculate that human language is designed to employ syntactic or formal features as a device to encode the duality of semantics in terms of featural asymmetry. Well, while we do need more evidence, of course, to establish 42, it provides what appears to be an interesting insight into the roles and functioning of syntactic features. Note that 42 does not specify, this is an important point, 42 does not specify which feature is to be employed for the duality of semantics. Okay, we will propose that features other than 5 features may also be utilized for encoding predicate argument structure. We will see in the next section that the Japanese exhibits exactly this kind of situation, in fact. How much time do I have? 10 more? 15? 15 more minutes. Okay, let me go on. Well, syntax without 5 features, that's a kind of a good old topic for me. It is known that Japanese is a language that exhibits no active 5 features for nominal declension and subject-verb agreement. Thus, regardless of the semantic person, number, and gender of the subject NP, the verb form always stays the same, as exemplified in 44. That's a familiar example. Well, based on this traditional observation, I put forth long time ago the hypothesis that Japanese is a language that lacks 5 features in its lexicon. That's 43. Okay. Well, an immediate consequence of this hypothesis is that predicate argument structure for the external argument cannot be encoded by 5-feature asymmetry in Japanese type languages, simply because there's no 5-feature available in its lexicon. Well, recall that the relevant D-structure semantics was characterized by the 5-feature asymmetry in 45A in English. This option is unavailable in 5-featureless language like Japanese. Interestingly, however, Japanese seems to have a peculiar system that sort of makes up for the lack of 5 features in the language. It is a less known observation that Japanese has a rather complex system of verbal conjugations. We refer to the set of grammatical conjugational features here as kai features, kai for conjugation. Well, there are 2 kinds of kai features in Japanese. One is a group feature that differentiates 5 classes of verbal conjugation, and the second is a so-called stem form feature whose value depends upon the features of CT, such as force and modal, 46. Okay. And 47 and 48 show the group 1 and group 3 paradigms of verbal conjugation. Clearly, the verbal form changes according to the CT suffix attached to it. 47 and 48. Okay. Well, building on this observation, we propose that it is kai features that fulfill the function of encoding the asymmetric D-structure semantics for structures like 45B in Japanese. So there is a contrast between 45A English and 45B Japanese with respect to the kind of features that sort of encode the asymmetry. 45B counts as asymmetric, well, thanks to the presence of a chi feature zone V, which is different from the English type structure in 45A, whose featural asymmetry is characterized by the presence of 5 features on N. So it's a contrast between chi features on little v as opposed to 5 features on little n. We propose the lexicon in 48 for Japanese. Is that 48? Oh. Anything else? Okay. which is minimally different. The Japanese lexicon is minimally, as I said, minimally different from English in that it lacks 5 features, but its little b and capital C have chi features. This sole difference derives a number of interesting properties of Japanese syntax, as we will see shortly. It's now 49, right? Okay, that's the same. Oh, there you go. So let's skip to consequence 2. Okay. Right there. Okay. The consequence 2 is that there is no obligatory subject raising in Japanese type languages. Recall first that the movement of the subject little np to the spec t position has an important function of forming 5-feature symmetry. Due to the presence of 5 features, this symmetry forming operation is obligatory in languages like English. That's 52. In contrast, if 5 features are totally absent, it is expected that the language also lacks obligatory subject raising. This is exactly what happens in Japanese, which is, as you know, independently known as a language that shows no evidence for obligatory subject raising, 53. Okay, so that's accounted for. The third consequence of 5-feature free syntax is that the spec T position remains as a vacant site for so-called major subject topic-like elements in Japanese type languages. That's exemplified, as illustrated by 54 as opposed to 55. Okay. Furthermore, it is predicted that TP is not closed off, in my terminology back then, by any F equilibrium in Japanese type languages. Thus, any number of little np's can be merged into this domain. Indeed, more than one topic-like np's can be freely merged to a sentential structure in Japanese, as shown in 57. That's the famous celebrated Kuno's example. Well, the corresponding structure in English, of course, is ungrammatical, 58. But this is again expected because TP is in a phi equilibrium already and hence closed off in 5 feature-based languages like English. Okay, and consequence number 5 next. Well, finally, note that little np's do not form any F equilibrium with their merge mates in Japanese type languages. Thus, without having any sort of a magnetic power around, little np's can freely undergo scrambling, optional dislocation. Japanese has been a textbook example of scrambling languages where little np's can freely move around, as exemplified in 60. But this peculiarity now follows as a consequence of its lack of 5 features. While contrasting with Japanese, English, among many other languages, does not exhibit optional scrambling, and thus multiple fronting of little np's is impossible, as in 61. The impossibility of little np scrambling in English follows from the fact that such little np's have 5 features and they are frozen in positions, forming a 5-feature equilibrium, as in 63. In contrast, there is no phi equilibrium in Japanese type languages. Thus, little np's can freely move around without getting frozen. And that's stated in 62. Notice that if the analysis presented here is on the right track, we need to hypothesize that XP, YP structures with no prominent features, such as 54 and 62 back there, also count as symmetric for the purpose of assigning topic-like S structure interpretation. This is, in fact, kind of partially implied in the definition of feature symmetry in 21, as I briefly mentioned, where we use the connective if, not only if. So if there's no such a feature around, then the equilibrium is obtained. This is, anyway, I come back to that later. Well, this is all like, sort of like putting old wine into a new bottle, which makes a lot of sense, though, here. Okay, well, it is particularly important to note here that the macro parametric variation discussed, quote-unquote macro parametric variation discussed here, simply results from the underspecified nature of UG. Recall our hypothesis that the existence of formal syntactic features is grounded in the need for asymmetry coding, see section 3.2, but UG does not specify which feature is to be employed or utilized for that. Okay, thus UG allows the possibility that English utilizes 5 features on little n, while Japanese utilizes chi features on little v for the same purpose of encoding asymmetric D-structure semantics for the external argument. Well, therefore, no brute force stipulation on the constituents of UG is necessary here to account for the so-called macro parametric variation, simplifying linguistic theory to a considerable extent. Well, summing up, it's about time to sum up. Summing up, in this talk, we tried to establish the generalization in 64 and discuss its implications. We argued that this pattern follows as a consequence of symmetry-driven syntax. First of all, free merge yields the natural bifurcation of external versus internal merge, or base versus non-base merge. The first type of merge is the operation that draws new elements from the lexicon and introduces them into the derivation. Thus, it has a function of generating structural asymmetry. Given that the relevant notion of symmetry is defined in terms of syntactic features of lexical items, well, once a syntactic feature is embedded into an asymmetric structure, it must be displaced to a position where it can form a feature equilibrium. Okay. This is a requirement 27, reproduced here as 65. Each syntactic feature f must form an f equilibrium in the course of the derivation. Well, therefore, the first type merge generates asymmetric structures, whereas the second type merge applies to maximize structural symmetry. The ordering that the first type merge precedes the second type merge is thus derived from the idea that linguistic computation is driven for symmetry. Further, it is known that natural languages exhibit asymmetric D-structure semantics and non-asymmetric S-structure semantics, and it is naturally expected that this duality of semantics is designed to correlate with the structural symmetry and asymmetry, yielding the pattern in 64. In short, we argue that the pattern in 64 can be systematically accounted for by the overarching hypothesis that linguistic computation is driven for symmetry, where the notion of symmetry is defined in terms of features. We argue that the theory put forth in this talk derives not only the generalization in 64, but also the effect of abstract case and a number of differences between 5-feature-based languages like English and 5-feature free languages like Japanese. Although a number of important implications of the proposal remain to be discussed, we hope that the analysis presented in this talk sheds some light on the nature of structure generation and the syntax-semantic interface of human language. Okay, just it may have looked a little bit complicated, but the idea that we are sort of proposing here is very simple. A human language is designed in such a way that for some reason asymmetry is inserted into it. Okay. Now that there is a general principle that linguistic computation is driven for symmetry, once asymmetry is inserted in for some reason, well, now it sort of triggers linguistic computation, so that computation will end up symmetrizing it maximally. Once the symmetry is reached, then the computation stops. Okay, that's basically, and notice that this asymmetry concept ought to be characterized in terms of features rather than LIs. That's basically our main claim in this talk. And as I said, for some reason, asymmetry is inserted into linguistic expressions so that computation is driven for symmetry. Well, now, of course, the most important question to be addressed is for which reason is such an asymmetry required to be inserted into linguistic expressions? Okay. And what is the reason for the symmetry driven? Why is it that syntactic computation is driven for symmetry rather than otherwise? Okay. These are the very important questions to be addressed in a future talk. Okay? But for now, we have to stop here. Okay? Thank you very much.